This is day 2 of the government shutdown, and guess what? People are getting up, they're going to work, they're coming home, they're eating dinner with their families, they're going out to restaurants, and it all seems to be just great. But there's no sign of any ending right now. Wendy?
House leaders have proposed a plan that would get parts of the budget funded, but so far there's been no deal, and Republicans are accusing Democrats of refusing to negotiate. Ephraim Graham reports.
The newest Republican plan would reopen portions of the government, like national parks, veteran services, and the District of Columbia. But a 2/3 vote was needed to send the bill to the Senate, and House Democrats refused to get on board.
They took hostages by shutting down the government, and now they're releasing one hostage at a time.
Republicans say Democrats and the White House refuse to even hear their efforts to negotiate.
As you know, the House has proceeded in 5 different fashions to try and resolve this situation and not to end up here. But at each and every turn, the Senate Democrats refused to even discuss these proposals and instead tabled every one of them.
Republicans are seeking delays on parts of the president's health care reform. They also want to get rid of Congress's exemption to Obamacare. Earlier Tuesday, the Senate rejected a House request to begin a conference committee with members from both chambers to try and resolve the parties' differences. Meanwhile, 800,000 federal workers are at home without pay. President Obama warns a prolonged shutdown could have a bad effect on the economy.
It would throw a wrench into the gears of our economy at a time when those gears have gained some traction.
But Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment, says investors don't appear to be concerned.
This is certainly not new territory. This is something we've been through many, many times before. And, the stock market basically shrugged it off today, which I think tells you a lot about how investors are viewing this.
Meanwhile, some Republicans are starting to break ranks and calling for legislation to fund the government with no conditions.
I think this shutdown's a bad idea, and I want a clean CR.
Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
It's amazing we have a president who is disengaged. He's going to take a trip abroad. He just doesn't seem to care. And it's just easy to make a speech and blame the other guys. But in terms of negotiating, we do have a Congress that, according to the United States Constitution, is really very preeminent. As far as I can read the Constitution, the House of Representatives is the most important branch, according to the feeling of the framers, because they represented the people, and they call it the People's House. But the White House seems to think that he's an imperial president, he's a monarch. He doesn't need to talk to those peasants over there in Congress, and he'll just do what he wants to do. Well, we'll see what happens. Well, the Obamacare insurance exchanges were rolled out Tuesday, but there were some snags. I think that's an understatement. There were quite a few. But John Jessup has more from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. Here's John.
Pat, it was a bumpy first day for the president's new health care law. Uninsured Americans started signing up Tuesday for health care coverage through the government's online insurance marketplaces. Several million people visited healthcare.gov, but for many, the website has been a technical nightmare. Computer glitches, error messages, and long delays prevented them from enrolling in healthcare exchanges. In Dallas, only 30 people were able to sign up through the site. On top of the delays, potential buyers are also trying to evaluate the costs.
It's hard because you also need to think about your income and, what if you can't afford to have it?
I'm still weighing my options, but right now as an individual, the penalty for not having insurance is much cheaper than paying a monthly premium at the moment.
Americans who don't buy health coverage by March 31st will face fines. President Obama's diplomatic outreach to Iran could get harder. Congress is moving forward with tougher U.S. economic sanctions against Iran's nuclear program. This comes after the first contact between the two countries' leaders in more than 30 years. In July, the House adopted legislation that increases penalties that went into effect last year. The penalties have cut Iran's petroleum exports in half. The new sanctions are expected to be finalized in November, and that gives the White House only a few weeks to see whether Iran really changes course under President Rouhani. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fought back against Iran's charm offensive at the United Nations Tuesday. He warned the General Assembly that Iran's nuclear program is as dangerous as ever. And as Chris Mitchell reports, he pledged Israel would never allow Iran to get a nuclear bomb.
Netanyahu's pledge included a veiled threat of an Israeli military strike.
Ladies and gentlemen, Israel will never acquiesce to nuclear arms in the hands of a rogue regime that repeatedly promises to wipe us off the map. Against such a threat, Israel will have no choice but to defend itself. I want there to be no confusion on this point. Israel will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. If Israel is forced to stand alone, Israel will stand alone.
Iran called the speech inflammatory, but Netanyahu said if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it would be like 50 North Koreas. He also warned about Iran's charm offensive and smile campaign, launched by its new president, Hassan Rouhani.
Now, I know Rouhani doesn't sound like Ahmadinejad, but when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons program, the only difference between them is this. Ahmadinejad was a wolf in wolf's clothing. Rouhani is a wolf in sheep's clothing, a wolf who thinks he can pull the wool over the eyes of the international community.
Netanyahu declared a nuclear Iran represented not only an existential threat to Israel, but also a clear and present danger to the United States and Western powers. He argued sanctions must be kept in place. He also invoked the biblical prophet Amos.
In our time, the biblical prophecies are being realized. As the prophet Amos said, they shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall till gardens and eat their fruit. And I will plant them upon their soil, never to be uprooted again. Ladies and gentlemen, the people of Israel have come home, never to be uprooted again.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
The first group of inspectors are now in Syria to oversee the destruction of the country's chemical weapons. The international team must complete the task of finding, dismantling, and destroying the estimated 1,000-ton arsenal, and they have to do it before the middle of next year. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is using secret routes. That's to protect their safety and Syria's goal of keeping military locations private. Syria agreed to surrender its chemical weapons stockpiles after President Obama agreed to a deal made by the Russians. Well, after 3 weeks of fighting between Philippine troops and Muslim rebels, the violence in the southern city of Zamboanga is over. Now leaders face the difficult task of rebuilding their community and helping traumatized victim residents move forward. Area churches are working with CBN to help the mostly Muslim victims. Lucille Tolusan reports from Zamboanga.
Christina is still shaken as she recounts how God miraculously saved her from being hostage at the height of the fighting. She went up to her room to rest when the MNLF Muslim rebels barged into their boarding house and took with them her 3 female housemates.
I cried out to God to help me and surrendered everything to Him. After 2 days, I managed to get out of the house and leave the place by pretending to be Muslim.
Christina now stays at their church. Her pastor, Yoli Trinidad, also shares the horrifying accounts of her relatives who were held hostage for more than a week.
They said they were ordered to walk under the heat of the sun, and they beheaded with their machetes those who became weak and threw the dead bodies in the houses that they burned.
In the midst of the crisis in their city, Pastor Yoli and her husband shouldered the burden of caring for the suffering refugees, especially the infants. Pastor Yoli is grateful to partner with CBN.
We now have 130 evacuees, but we don't have the capability to supply all their needs. And that is why we are very happy when CBN came to Zamboanga. They united our churches and empowered us to help our communities. We are able to give food not only to the evacuees, but to the military as well.
Most of the evacuees in this school come from the Muslim-dominated villages that are indifferent towards the Christians. And that is why the church volunteers here are happy to have been given the opportunity to serve them and to share with them the love of Christ.
Our city is facing a difficult crisis, but God's purpose still prevails. What the enemy meant for evil, God turns into good. It's a time for God's love to shine.
Lucille Talusan, CBN News, Zamboanga, Philippines.
Pat, this morning in my devotion, I was reading Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he instructs his disciples to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. And what we're seeing in Zamboanga is a clear demonstration of that by both the Christians and the work of CBN.
No question about it. And it's always the way it's supposed to be when you're following the Lord's teaching. Wendy was over there. You were in that very region. Tell us about it.
Just last summer, Lucille and I were walking through the streets of Zamboanga. You know, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the Philippines, but it's also one of the most terrifying for the residents and for visitors. I mean, they behead people, the Abu Sayyaf, but you know that the Muslim Islamic spirit is so tangible in that area of the Philippines, and they really need our prayers. And it's.
What did you find about those people? Are they crazy? Are they just zealots? What?
They're poor, and they're just drawn to this cause. The Abu Sayyaf, it's sort of like a gang. They can get money, they can get food, they have a family, and then the bigger picture is they can say, oh, we want, an independent Muslim state, and that's, but they're really just a bunch of thugs, and they're creating such heartache for the people of the Philippines.
I hope the government can prevail them, but it's not easy. Well, thanks, Wendy.
School districts and teachers across the country are expected to promote LGBT History Month to students during October. The Pacific Justice Institute has issued a warning to parents. They say gay history in schools is inappropriate, pointing to the main website for LGBT History Month, which highlights historical figures in the movement. Among the usual activists and celebrities are individuals whose work is X-rated. They include a man known for his contribution to gay porn and a bisexual erotic fiction author. Kenya's president is vowing to keep its troops in Somalia to help battle the Islamic extremist group Al-Shabaab. The Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group claims responsibility for that deadly attack at a Nairobi shopping mall last month. Al-Shabaab says the attack was in retaliation for Kenya sending in troops to neighboring Somalia in 2011. The group warned there will be more attacks unless Kenya withdraws. Kenya's president says they plan to investigate where there were security lapses so they can prevent future attacks. Well, you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.